Okay everyone, welcome back to our lecture video for Chapter 8. Chapter 8 will cover the appendicular skeleton. So a brief review, in Chapter 6 we discussed the mechanics of bones. In Chapter 7 we discussed the axial skeleton and the bones that make up the axial skeleton. And in Chapter 8 we're going to discuss the appendicular skeleton and the different bones that can be found making up this division of the skeletal system. The appendicular skeleton is made up of the shoulder girdle, the pelvic girdle, as well as the bones of the arms and the legs. We call it the appendicular skeleton because it refers to our body's appendages. The appendicular skeleton will include 126 bones and the rest of the bones that we did not discuss in Chapter 7 under the axial skeleton. So we saw this slide in Chapter 7 when we discussed the axial skeleton and some of the bones that make it up. However, we also will see the appendicular skeleton. So you can see the appendicular skeleton on this picture highlighted in blue. And there are a few more bones that can be found in the appendicular skeleton compared to the axial skeleton. So we have a total of 126 bones found within the appendicular skeleton. Again, we have the bones of the shoulder girdle, the arms, the pelvic girdle, and the leg. Those are our four major regions that make up the appendicular skeleton. So the bones that can be found in the pectoral girdle are the clavicle and the scapula. The clavicle is also referred to as the collarbone, and the scapula contains what is known as the shoulder blade. There are quite a few bones that can be found on the upper and lower limbs, and we will discuss those in this class. And we'll also discuss the pelvic girdle and the major bones that make them up. We call the two hip bones coxal bones. So one bone on either side here is going to meet in the center, and that's going to make up the hips. So again, in total we have 126 bones found in the appendicular skeleton. If we add that to how many bones we have in the axial skeleton, which is 80, that's going to give us a total of 206 bones that we can find in the human body. So the appendicular skeleton makes up our appendages. And these appendages are going to help us to produce different types of body movements. Most of the movement in our bodies does come from our arms and our legs. So with our limbs we can do things like walk around and play sports and a lot of other physical activities as well. So the appendicular skeleton is going to be found more laterally than the axial skeleton will. And that's very important because each of these bones will occur twice within the body, once on the right side and once on the left side. So the bones that make up the shoulder girdle are the clavicle and the scapula. We can also call this the pectoral girdle because this is found in the pectoral region. The clavicle is shown here. This is also known more colloquially as the collarbone, and the scapula can be found on the back side of the body. So this side shows us a posterior view, and this side shows us an anterior view. I mentioned in the last presentation that I want you guys to be focusing on how these bones articulate with one another. So in Chapter 7 we discussed the sternum, and this upper part of the sternum is known as the manubrium. So the clavicles will actually come in here and articulate with the manubrium of the sternum in the center. Each clavicle is going to have 2 points of articulation, and our other point of articulation is on the scapula, at a place known as the acromion process. Now I have also included in this presentation these study guide slides as well, so these will take you to your Wiley Plus material so that you can see some of these structures. And once again, you will find these slides scattered throughout this presentation as well. So there are 2 clavicles, a right and a left. And each clavicle is going to have a medial end and a lateral end. And we will more accurately call these the sternal end and the acromial end based on where these 2 structures are articulating. So the sternal end is going to articulate with the manubrium, which is that upper portion of the sternum. We see the sternal end here. The clavicle is an S-shaped bone. It's relatively shaped like an S. So each of our clavicles are going to have a medial or a sternal end and a lateral or an acromial end. Again, this end is named because it articulates with the acromion process of the scapula. Now all of our bones are going to have some special markings that can be found on them. However, there's only one that I want you guys to understand for the clavicle, and that is the conoid tubercle. The conoid tubercle is going to be found on the acromial end or the lateral end of our clavicle. And so this is just a bony projection that comes out here and serves as a surface area for muscle attachment. Now the other bone that makes up the shoulder girdle is the scapula. The scapula is a flat bone that can be found located posteriorly behind the thoracic cage on either side of the body. Now, I expect in your lab class that you will cover the different parts of the scapula in much greater detail, but there are a few parts that are important here for my lecture class as well. So one structure that I've already mentioned is the acromion process. This is projecting from the posterior side of the scapula, and this will allow for the articulation with the clavicle. So you can see the acromion process up here. This shows us a posterior view of the scapula, so this is what it looks like from the back side of the body, and this is an anterior view, so you can see the acromion up here. We'll also see the acromion from a lateral view here, and this is just one of the many structures that we find on the scapula. One of the other most important bone markings we see with the scapula is this space here known as the glenoid cavity. Now this can also be called the glenoid fossa, depending on who you're speaking to, but the glenoid cavity serves a very important role. The glenoid cavity is the location where the humerus bone will articulate with the scapula. The humerus is the upper arm bone, and so that's going to come in here, and this is going to be the main point of articulation for the shoulder. We will also have the coracoid process. The coracoid process is a bony projection that will be sticking out in this region. This sticks out more towards the front or the anterior side of the bone. So this will also serve as a surface area for muscle attachments. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of special parts that can be found on the scapula. However, I just want you to focus on the acromion process, the coracoid process, and the glenoid cavity. These are going to be major areas where muscles attach and also bones will articulate. And the bones that are articulating are the clavicle with the acromion process and the humerus with the glenoid cavity. So the humerus is the bone that can be found in the upper portion of the arm. This bone spans from the shoulder to the elbow. And as I mentioned on the last slide, the humerus is articulating with the scapula at the glenoid cavity. The humerus is a long bone, and so this bone has two epiphyses at either end, and at the top end we have the head of the humerus. And the head of the humerus is what's going to sit in that glenoid cavity of the scapula. Now at the distal end of this bone we have two other smooth parts of our bone that will aid in articulations. And those are the capitulum and the trochlea. These are two smooth areas on the humerus that will allow for the articulation of the two bones of the lower arm, which are the radius and the ulna. The ulna will be specifically articulating with the trochlea, and the radius will be articulating with the capitulum. So while each bone does have many different bone markings and different regions found within that bone, I just want you guys to focus on the specific bone markings that aid in articulation. So this here is an anterior view of how the humerus is going to articulate with the scapula as well as the radius and the ulna. The humerus is this long bone that has a center diaphysis and two epiphyses at either ends. The proximal epiphysis is going to have a head, and this head will fit into the glenoid cavity of the scapula. And the scapula has the acromion process, and you can see that articulating with the clavicle. Now at the distal end of the humerus we have two smooth regions, one the capitulum and two the trochlea. The capitulum and the trochlea are going to aid for the articulation of the radius and the ulna respectively. So you can see the ulna is going to be found back here, and we'll see the radius right here. In the anatomical position, the radius is going to be found more lateral than the ulna will, and the ulna will be found more medial than the radius will. So the trochlea forms this nice groove by which the ulna can articulate with and slide through this space, while the radius is going to sort of rotate about this capitulum. Now there are three other bone markings that I'd like you to know about the humerus, and those are the coronoid fossa, the radial fossa, and the olecranon fossa. And all of these fossa are named by the structure of the process that goes into that fossa. A fossa is just some type of depression or basin-like structure that can be found on a bone. And so they allow for a space for other bony projections to fit nicely into these various fossa. So the olecranon fossa is going to give a space for the olecranon process to come in and sit while these bones are articulating. The olecranon process is going to be found on the ulna. We'll also see on the anterior side that the coronoid fossa is going to leave a space for the coronoid process to come in when these two bones are articulating. And then we'll also have the radial fossa where the radius bone can come and sit whenever these bones are articulated in a particular way. So in review of what's going on at the distal end of the humerus, we have the trochlea and the capitulum that are articulating with the ulna and the radius respectively. And we have these three different fossa that can be found on the humerus as well to allow for certain bone markings on the radius and the ulna to come in and fit when these bones are articulating. So that will take us into the specific bone markings of the ulna and the radius. Now the two major bone projections on the ulna are two that we've just mentioned on the last slide. The olecranon process and the coronoid process. And together, these two bone processes make up what is known as the trochlear notch. So by now you might be making some of these associations. The olecranon process on the back of the ulna is fitting in the olecranon fossa of the humerus. And the coronoid process of the ulna is going to sit in the coronoid fossa of the humerus. And the same thing happens to the radius. The head of the radius specifically is going to fit into the radial fossa. Now I also mentioned that the coronoid process and the olecranon process form the trochlear notch. And that is going to be the place where the trochlea sits. So the ulna forms a little notch known as the trochlear notch. The olecranon process is going to be this larger projection out here, and the coronoid process will be found at this region, at the anterior side. So you can see the coronoid process in here, and the olecranon process is going to be found on the posterior side of the ulna. Now we'll also have the radius. The radius is found more laterally when in the anatomical position. The radius is going to articulate with the capitulum, and it will sit in the radial fossa when our arm is fully flexed. So once again, you can see the olecranon process and the coronoid process with their respective fossa that they will be sitting in. So when the arm is fully flexed, the coronoid process will be sitting in the coronoid fossa. However, when the arm is extended, the olecranon process will sit in the olecranon fossa. Now there's one other distinction that I want to draw about the bones that surround the humerus. I mentioned that up here in the scapula, this is known as the coracoid process, and down here on the ulna, we have the coronoid process. So don't get these two mixed up. They sound very similar, but the coronoid process is found here on the ulna, and the coracoid process is found up on the scapula. The only difference is in the spelling of one letter. Coronoid has an N, and coracoid has a C. The bone that has an N in the name is going to contain the coronoid process, and the bone that has the C in the name is going to contain the coracoid process. So hopefully that will help you to remember the coracoid process and the coronoid process in which bones that they belong. Now that will take us into the wrist. The wrist is made up of 8 short bones known as carpal bones. And these carpal bones are arranged in 2 rows. We have a proximal row and we have a distal row. So naturally, the proximal row is found more proximal and the distal row is going to be found more distal. So the bones that can be found in the proximal row are the scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, and pisiform. All of these bones in the proximal row will be articulating with the radius and the ulna, because as they are found more proximally, they will contact these bones. The distal row is going to contain 4 other carpal bones, and these will articulate with another set of bones known as metacarpals, which are the bones that can be found in the hand. So the 4 carpal bones that make up the distal row are the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. Each of the bones in the distal row will be articulating with the bones in the proximal row, as well as the metacarpal bones that can be found in the hand. So each hand is going to contain 5 bones known as metacarpals. And instead of giving each of these 5 bones their own unique names like we've done with all the other bones in the arm, we will just simply number the metacarpals of the hand, starting at the thumb. So in the anatomical position, the most lateral metacarpal that can be found in the thumb is going to be metacarpal 1. The metacarpal that will be found attaching to the index finger is going to be metacarpal 2. The middle finger will be metacarpal 3, and so forth, all the way until we get to the metacarpal for the pinky, which will be metacarpal 5. And it's also important to include a side for our metacarpals. We have right metacarpals and we have left metacarpals. So both of the first metacarpals will be found most laterally, and both of the 5th metacarpals will be found more medially. So those metacarpals will be articulating with the distal row of the carpals, as well as the bones that make up our fingers, which are known as phalanges. Now in each hand we have 14 phalanges. Each finger is going to have 3, except for the thumb, which will only have 2. So once again we will use a naming system to name each of the phalanges. So we have proximal, middle, and distal phalanges on each finger. And the proximal phalange is going to articulate with the metacarpal bones, as well as with the middle phalange. The middle phalange will articulate with the proximal phalange and the distal phalange, and the distal phalange will only articulate with the middle phalange. Now this is true for all of our fingers except for the thumbs. Remember, the thumbs only have 2 phalanges. They have a proximal phalange and a distal phalange. So if we go to the last bone that we can find on the middle finger of the right hand, we would say that this bone is the 3rd distal phalange of the right hand. And that's how we will name all of these different phalanges that we find making up our fingers. We use a naming system instead of true names for these bones. So hopefully this picture will help us to make some sense of all of the bones that can be found in the hands. So from the wrist towards the fingers, there are a lot of bones. In fact, we have more bones found in the wrist and the hands than we do making up the entire arm. So let's go through some of these bones. We have the proximal row, where we find the trapezium, the scaphoid, the lunate, and the pisiform. And then the distal row will be made up of the trapezium, the capitate, the trapezoid, and the hamate. Those distal phalanges are going to articulate with the metacarpals, and each metacarpal you can see is named 1 through 5. So here at the thumb, this is the most lateral metacarpal, so we will call this metacarpal 1, metacarpal 2, metacarpal 3, and so forth, all the way to the most medial metacarpal 5. On each finger, we'll have 3 phalanges. We have a proximal, middle, and distal phalange, except for the thumb. The thumb is only going to have 2 phalanges, and those will be a proximal phalange and a distal phalange. So that will take us into the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is made up of the 2 coxal bones. Those can also be called hip bones or os coxa, but I usually will call these coxal bones, and on your test you will see these appear as coxal bones. Now each of the coxal bones will be articulating with the sacrum that can be found at the base of the vertebral column, and we discussed the sacrum in Chapter 7. However, the coxal bones are also going to articulate with each other at what is known as the pubic symphysis. So these 2 bones will be articulating with the sacrum as well as with each other. And so this location where these 2 bones articulate is going to contain a disc of fibrocartilage, and we will refer to this as the pubic symphysis. Now each coxal bone is actually a set of 3 bones that have been fused together. Those 3 bones that make up each coxal bone are the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So let's take a look at the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis and see how these will come together to form our coxal bones. So the ilium is this winged portion up here. This is the ilium, and this rough area is where we're going to see the articulation with the sacrum. So the ilium is this upper portion of our bone. We also have the ischium, which can be found in this region down here, and we'll have the pubis that will be found at the front right here. So both of the pubis bones will come together and meet right here where we find the pubic symphysis. So the 2 ilium bones are going to articulate with the sacrum, and the 2 pubi of our coxal bones are going to articulate with each other at the pubic symphysis. Now we have this very large depression that can be found in the coxal bone. The name of this depression is known as the acetabulum. The acetabulum is a very, very pronounced facet that we see on our bones that will allow for the articulation with the main leg bone known as the femur. The femur has a very pronounced head, and it will fit very nicely into the acetabulum. The acetabulum is also made up of each of these 3 bones. So I'd like you to know that. You can see that the pubis, the ischium, and the ilium all make up this facet known as the acetabulum. So this slide is just repeating the things that I've just said. The femur is articulating with the acetabulum of each of our coxal bones, and the acetabulum is made up of the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. All 3 pelvic bones come together to form that acetabulum. Now, one of the very interesting concepts that we see with the pelvic girdle is that we can actually distinguish male and female pelvises based on the pronunciation of structures and the way that those coxal bones are going to look. The male pelvis tends to be a little bit larger and heavier. It's going to have thicker bone, and it's going to be more narrow. The female pelvis is going to be structured in order to meet the requirements of childbirth. So we'll see a different structure in the female pelvis when we relate that to the male pelvis. The male's pelvis tends to be deeper and narrower, while the female pelvis tends to be more wide and shallow. So these are 2 pictures of the male and the female pelvis. The male's pelvis and female pelvis, again, look very different, and the female's pelvis is structured to meet the requirements of childbirth and pregnancy. So in terms of the general structure, the male pelvis tends to be a lot heavier and thicker than the female pelvis is. The female pelvis is going to be a little bit lighter and thinner. Now the male pelvis is not going to have as wide of an arrangement with the ilium bones. You can see the female pelvis is going to have a little bit wider and more open ilium bones, while the male's is going to be a little bit more closed off. The male pelvis is also going to be a little bit longer and taller than the female's will be. This is going to be a little bit shallower and shorter. Another major difference that I find to be very important is the acetabulum location. With females, the acetabulum tends to be smaller and will actually face towards the front of the body. So you can see the acetabulum here, and the female is pointing towards the front. However, in the male, the acetabulums are going to be a bit larger, and they're going to actually face more laterally, so they'll be pointed more towards the sides. And while all of these characteristics can help us to distinguish a male pelvis from a female pelvis, one of the most notable characteristics that we look at to distinguish the male from the female pelvis is what is known as the pubic arch. So you can see the pubic symphysis found right here. The pubic arch is going to be shown right here. This arch between the ischium, the pubis of one coxal bone, and the ischium and the pubis of the other coxal bone. So in females, the pubic arch is going to be greater than 90 degrees. We're going to have an obtuse angle that can be found here. However, in the male, this is going to produce an acute angle. This is going to be less than 90 degrees. So the pubic arch is my personal favorite way to tell the difference between the male and the female pelvis. Here are some other characteristics that we can use to distinguish the male and the female pelvis. You can see that just macroscopically, these look very different. This is a much taller, much more narrow and slim pelvic bone than this is. So the major differing factor that I'd like to show you on this slide is the location of the sacrum. The sacrum in the male is going to point more anteriorly, and it's going to cover up what is known as the pelvic inlet. Well, in the female pelvis, the sacrum is going to be curved less anteriorly because this pelvis needs to meet the criteria for giving birth. So another place that we can see the difference between the sacrums is on this slide as well. You can see that the pelvic inlet refers to this hole, and in the female, when undergoing childbirth, the baby is going to pass through this pelvic inlet. So it's important that the sacrum is actually curved less anteriorly because that's going to provide more room for the baby to travel out of the female body. So you can see the pelvic inlet on this slide with the female pelvis is showing us that it's a little bit more oval-shaped and wide, again, because a child's going to need to fit here. However, that's not going to be the same case in the male, so this is going to be a little bit more narrow and relatively heart-shaped as well. So these are some ways that we can distinguish the female pelvis from the male pelvis. So once more, I'll just mention that the pelvic outlet is going to be a little wider in females. It's going to be a bit more narrower in males. So the pelvic inlet and the pelvic outlet are pretty much referring to the same space that can be found here. But as you can see, there are many different ways that we can tell the difference between a female pelvis and a male pelvis. So that will take us into the leg. Remember, the pelvis has the acetabulum, which is where the femur is going to articulate. Now the femur is the one bone that is found within the thigh. The femur courses from the hip all the way to the knee. And the femur is also the longest and strongest bone that we have in our bodies. So the proximal end of the femur will articulate with the acetabulum. The distal ends are going to articulate with the bones of the lower leg, namely the tibia, and the distal end is mainly going to articulate with a bone known as the tibia. And it will also articulate with the patella as well. So here we see the femur articulating at the acetabulum. This is our posterior view, and this is our anterior view. So you can see the femur has this very pronounced head and a very pronounced neck. And so this bone will fit nicely into the acetabulum of the coxal bone. So this is our proximal side of our femur. As we make our way down, we'll see that the femur will articulate with the bone of the lower leg known as the tibia. Now the femur is going to have two condyles, which are projections for joint formation. So we'll have lateral condyles and we'll have medial condyles. And those are going to be the two locations where the femur articulates with the tibia bone. You can also see the patella here that's articulating with the femur as well. So the patella is our most notable sesamoid bone. This bone is wrapped in the patellar tendon, and that's what a sesamoid bone is, any bone that is enveloped in a tendon. So you can see it has this very flat facet here, which is just a flat articular surface, to allow this to articulate with the femur. Now, when we get to the lower leg, we're going to have the tibia and the fibula. Just as in the lower arm, we have two bones, the radius and the ulna. The lower leg will consist of the tibia and the fibula. So the tibia is articulating with the femur, the fibula, and the first bone of the ankle, known as the talus. So the tibia is articulating with the femur, the fibula, and the talus bone, which can be found in the ankle. So you can see the tibia is going to have its own medial and lateral condyles, which will match up with the femur's medial and lateral condyles. But it will also have this space on the side where the fibula is going to come in. So this bone is the fibula. The fibula is articulating here at its proximal end with the tibia. So the fibula does not articulate with the femur at all. And the fibulas, just like the radius, are going to be found laterally located. You will always find the fibula on the lateral side of the body. The tibia and the fibula together form a little notch, and each of these bones have their own projection that forms this notch. So the tibia is going to contain what is known as the medial malleolus, which is this little notch down here that will help for our tibia to wrap around the talus bone, which is that first bone in the ankle. And the lateral malleolus will actually be found on the fibula. So you can see the tibia here is showing us the medial malleolus. This is going to form a nice little notch for the talus to sit within. And here we also have the fibular notch, which is where the fibula is going to come in and articulate with the tibia. Now that will bring us into the ankle. The ankle is made up of 7 bones known as tarsal bones. Carpal refers to the wrist, tarsal refers to the ankle. So our 7 tarsal bones are namely the talus, the calcaneus, the navicular bone, 3 different cuneiform bones, and the cuboid bone. The 2 major bones that I really want you to know out of all of these are the talus and the calcaneus. The talus, as I mentioned in the last slide, is articulating with the tibia, and the malleoli of the tibia and the fibula are going to be forming around this talus. The calcaneus is the very large bone that can be found in the ankle that makes up the heel. So these are going to be our 2 most important tarsal bones. Now, just as we saw in the hand, we will have metacarpals, and these will start with the great toe at metacarpal 1 and work their way out to the littlest toe with metacarpal 5. So just as we saw with the metacarpals, in the foot we're going to have metatarsals. We have 5 metatarsal bones. And again, just as we were set up with the metacarpals, the metatarsals are going to be set up the same way. So the metatarsal that leads up to the great toe is going to be metatarsal 1. And as we go out, we'll eventually get to metatarsal 5, which will be at the most lateral location. So the one major difference is that the first metatarsal is found more medially, while the first metacarpal is found more laterally. Now the distal ends of these metatarsals are going to articulate with the proximal phalanges. And just like we had in the hand, we're going to have proximal, middle, and distal phalanges. The great toe is only going to have a proximal and a distal phalange. It will not have a middle phalange. That will only be found on all 4 of the other digits. So the hands and feet are set up the same way. We use the same naming system. However, the major difference is that in the hand, the first metacarpal is found more laterally, and in the foot, the first metatarsal is found more medially. So here's a picture so we can see this. Right here we have the talus. This is the talus bone that will allow for the medial and malleolus to sit right above. So the talus is going to be here, and it's going to be the major bone of the ankle that articulates with the other bones of the leg. And the calcaneus is going to be found back here. The calcaneus is the bone that makes up the heel. So you can see a superior view from the top and an inferior view here. So this is the view of the sole of the foot, and we can see the very large calcaneus bone right here. Again, this is the great toe, so this is going to be found more medially. This is metatarsal 1, metatarsal 2, metatarsal 3, all the way to metatarsal 5, where we have the littlest toe. And each toe, or each digit, is going to have a proximal, middle, and distal phalange, except for the great toe, which will just have a proximal and a distal phalange like we saw in the hand. So that will conclude all of the bones of the appendicular skeleton. Always remember, the skeletal system is playing a role in all of our different body systems. The skeletal system will help to maintain the homeostasis in every single other system that we have in our bodies. So this is our nice slide to characterize this concept. So in terms of the skeletal system's contributions, we're going to see those here in the center, and on either side we're going to see how the skeletal system contributes to each of these other 10 body systems. So the skeletal system is made up of bones which support the body and protect visceral organs. Bone is also serving as our major calcium reservoir. So this is our major place in the body where we store calcium. And calcium is used in many of our other body systems, especially here in skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles use calcium to contract. We have to have calcium present in order to contract our skeletal muscles. But the skeletal system also helps out the muscular system by providing a surface area for those muscles to attach. We're also going to need calcium in the nervous system, and the skeletal system is playing a major role in protecting our nervous system structures. The rib cage is protecting the esophagus and the stomach, as well as the liver, and teeth are going to help us to chew food. So that's how the skeletal system will play a role in the digestive system also. And as we discussed in the structure of our long bone, red bone marrow that can be found stored in the space between those trabeculae of our spongy bone will help to produce lymphocytes, which are a very special type of blood cell, and those are going to help with our immune system. The skeletal system is also going to protect the respiratory system. Many of the respiratory structures are protected by the thoracic cage, so the lungs, for example. However, some of the muscles that we use to breathe are attached to bones, and without those bones, we wouldn't be able to leverage our bodies to breathe. We'll also see red blood cells that are coming from the red bone marrow that are going to be a major player in the cardiovascular system in transporting respiratory gases to the tissues and back to the lungs. So you can see with this picture, this shows us how integral the function of the skeletal system is to the rest of our bodies. All of our 11 body systems help out each of the other body systems that we have in some way or another. So this will conclude our lecture video for Chapter 8. I will see you all in the next video for Chapter 9 when we will discuss joints.